Black culture and consciousness are the products of a very unique experience, and they developed within a highly oppressive and limiting environment. That environment is called slavery, and down in the pit of slavery, people were forced to adapt and survive. And just like any other human would have done in this same situation, the enslaved developed a culture and a consciousness that was optimized for the slave world, but it was largely unfitting for the free world. And so we're going to talk about the world of the slave and get a little background about the internal and the external factors that contributed to the creation of Black culture and consciousness here in America. And to do that, we're going to read from this book here. It's called The Shaping of Black America by historian Lerone Bennett Jr. And so let's go on here to page 146, where he writes this. Slavery, in sum, was a major formative influence in the development of America, and it's impossible to understand the black man or the white man or America without a prior understanding of that institution, which is one of the reasons why we have been focusing on this subject, because you can't understand what a black or a white person really is or what they symbolically represent without considering the context of slavery, which is where they began. And so when you understand the context through a certain lens, then you can decide if this is something that you should continue being or not, right? But either way, you have to understand the institution of slavery. And so he continues with this. It is becoming increasingly clear, moreover, that slavery must be understood from the inside out. That is to say, from the standpoint of the slave. And to do that, one must deal at a depth level with slave narratives, slave culture, and the slave praxis. One must deal, in other words, with the practical language of the slave. What concerns us here is the shared understanding and shared sensibilities of that world, its modes of perception and expression, its channels of communication, its heroes, symbols, and myths. But before plunging into that world, let us pause for a moment to sense the atmosphere of the institution that shaped it and distorted it. A precursor of the modern totalitarianism, the institution of slavery in America was a total system of social, economic, political, and sexual exploitation based on force and violence, and an ideology of racism. And so he explains it as a total system, meaning the complete package, the 360 degrees of domination, which involved social exploitation, where they dehumanized people and they assigned them to the position as a piece of property. It involved economic exploitation by making them work without any wages, political exploitation by using the tool of the law to trap them in the pit, and the sexual exploitation of controlling the bodies of women and using them as breeders. And all of this was done by force, violence, and the ideology of racism, as he mentioned. But not just the ideology or the set of beliefs that encourage racism. It goes a layer deeper than that. It involves the idea of race in general, right? It's not just racism, which follows the acceptance of the idea of race. It's the idea of race itself, right? Which fundamentally has to be addressed. But let's keep going. At its peak in the antebellum period, this system of forced labor claimed the energies of some 4 million slaves, most of whom raised staple crops on plantation-sized units in the Black Belt areas of the southern states. For these individuals, and for the parasitic whites who fed off their transcendence, slavery had ominous political and psychological implications. Slavery not only stole the labor of the slaves, it also stole the meaning of their lives and subtly distorted the lives of their tormentors. To put the matter simply and rather bluntly, slavery was designed to turn human beings into human machines. And designed to mean that it was not by accident, right? It was created with an intention, and that intention was to create human machines. And machines only do what they're instructed to do by the operator, right? And in this case, the slave master was the operator who controlled where the slaves lived, how they ate, what they ate, right? How many hours they worked, what they called themselves, and so on and so forth, right? Let's keep going. The infamous slave codes, which were enacted by the legislatures of all states, proscribed the humanity of the slave by investing slave masters with absolute power. The Louisiana Slave Code said, "The slave can do nothing, possess nothing, nor acquire anything, but what must belong to his master." Under the provisions of the slave codes of Louisiana and other states, Slaves were sold on the open market, bred like cattle, wagered at poker tables, deeded in wills, and presented as presents at social events. It was a crime under these provisions for a slave to read and write. It was a crime punishable by a summary lashing for an African to stand up straight and look a white man in the eye. Now imagine that, being whooped for looking at another person in the eye. This is how these inferior and superior relationships were reinforced, by these type of societal rituals, right? Let's continue. It was a crime for slaves to hold meetings or religious services without a white witness. Slaves could not congregate in groups of more than 2 or 3 away from the home plantation. They could not beat drums, wear fine clothes, or carry sticks or weapons. They could not marry and could not protect their children or their mates. The power of the state, the power of the United States government, and all of the presidents from Washington to Lincoln stood behind these onerous provisions. An immense police apparatus was created by every southern state to awe the slaves and to beat them into submission. Slave patrols, authorized by state laws, policed plantation areas and made periodic searches of slave cabins. And who was part of these slave patrols? It was the poor whites who were used by the system to play this role. They were the ones who became very adamant about keeping the Negro held down in the pit, way below them, right? They looked forward to conducting these type of slave patrols so they can catch them an inward in the process. Here we go. Guards and special patrols stood in readiness at key installations. We get a glimpse of this police state from the writings of Frederick L. Olmsted, who remarked on police machinery such as you never find in towns under free government. Citadels, sentries, passports, grape-shooted cannon, and daily public whippings of the subjects for accidental infractions of police ceremonies. And so you can tell these whites were looking for any reason to put the hammer down on the Negro, right? Even whipping the Negro for violating certain rules by accident. Olmsted's observations are extremely interesting for the light they throw on the organic violence of the system. It is fashionable nowadays to speak disapprovingly of the atrocities of the slave system, but to single out isolated atrocities for condemnation is to miss the meaning of the system, which was an atrocity itself. Violence was not an accidental byproduct of that system. The system itself was violent. No one understood this better than the slaves. James C. Pennington, who escaped from slavery in Maryland and became one of the outstanding men of the 19th century, said, "The being of slavery, its soul and body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle. The cart whip, starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences to a greater or lesser extent, warring with the disposition of men." Pennington and other slave analysts said that whippings were common on all plantations and that few slaves made it through life without at least one lashing. It is the literal unvarnished truth, slave analyst Solomon Northup said, that the crack of the lash and the shrieking of the slaves can be heard from dark till bedtime, any day almost during the entire period of the cotton picking season. This is furthermore the testimony of Austin Stewart, who, like Northup, escaped from slavery and made his way up to the North. Said he, "No slave could possibly escape being punished. I care not how attentive they might be, nor how industrious. Punished they must be, and punished they were." At least 2 additional considerations must be taken into account in explaining this system. Pay attention. The first is that slavery was characterized by systematic brainwashing. What does it mean to brainwash someone? That means to scrub out the old ideas in someone's mind so they can be replaced with new ones, right? And this was often done through fear, force, and fraud. And so when the whites brainwashed the blacks, what ideas were they trying to instill in their minds? Let's find out. Slaves were taught to hate themselves and to stand in fear of every white man. Those are the ideas they wanted to program into their minds. Self-hate and fear, and they must have done a very, very good job at doing this because these effects still linger in many of the descendants today. And in fact, many years ago in the Marine Corps, I had a conversation with one of my junior Marines, and he confided in me that he hated having rich brown skin, right? Or what he called black, right? And I asked him why this was the case, and he responded that he just didn't like it. He didn't really have a valid reason for it. It's just something that he knew he didn't like. And there's plenty of other stories out there if you talk to people and you invite an honest conversation, right? But this self-hate, it stems from the conditioning through images, identities, and ideologies that were meant to possess the mind and to destroy it, right? Let's keep going. Every medium was used to detach them from prior sanctions and to flatten their perceptions and instincts. And that every includes religion, science, philosophy, the law, elite whites, poor whites, and even blacks themselves. All these mediums were used as tools to instill this program of self-destruction into the minds of the enslaved. And the more you understand this, the better you equip yourself to climb all the way out of the pit, because you have to understand and recognize the problem before finding and being willing to implement the right solution, right? Here we go. There is an extremely perceptive remark on this point in Alexis de Tocqueville's study of America, which was done in the 1800s. Now watch what he found. Said he, the only means by which the ancients maintained slavery were fetters and death, meaning they went in chains or they died in the ancient world, which was harsh enough, but it involved primarily the physical component to slavery. But watch this. The Americans of the South of the Union have discovered more intellectual securities for the duration of their power. They have employed their despotism and their violence against the human mind. You see that? The English, who later transformed themselves into white people, they went above and beyond the ancient forms of primarily physical slavery. They released their version 9.0 of slavery, which had new and improved updates, which took over the entire mind of the slaves, right? And by targeting the mind of the slaves, that's how they were able to extend the enslavement process and make it easier for themselves, right? They understood that if they can get the slaves to think in a certain way, that the slaves would then automatically instill that same 9.0 slavery program into their children, right? And they would essentially keep making copies of themselves or various versions of themselves for a very long time. Understand? And so in the 1800s, Alexis, who was a Frenchman, left the account describing the American slaveholders as employing violence against the human mind. And what else did he describe? Let's find out. Here we go. The second decisive aspect of the slave situation was fascist regimentation. Military discipline prevailed on most plantations, which had a chain of command ranging downward from the plantation owner to the white overseer and the black driver. Now, didn't I tell you about them using the blacks as tools too? Everyone and everything could be used as a tool in this system of domination. And we're going to learn more about these black drivers in a bit, and you'll be surprised. So let's keep reading. Here we go. Slaves were generally marched to and from their task in military formations and housed and fed in collective settings. In apportioning tasks, slave masters ignored distinctions of age and sex. The very young and the very old, males and females, worked in the fields. It didn't matter if they were a 90-year-old lady or a 9-year-old child, right? They were getting out there in the blazing hot sun and working in the field. Females dug ditches, cut down trees, cleared wildland, and worked on highways. Some plantations were manned entirely by a workforce of women, right? This is wild stuff here. Apart from this, it is important to recognize that all slaves were marked in one way or another by the inferno that engulfed them. And what's the inferno that engulfed them? That's just another word for hell, another word for Hades, another word for the grave, another word for the pit, right? It's a very low state with an oppressive system keeping their bodies and their minds restricted, right? And preventing them from making any meaningful advances. And all the slaves were engulfed in this inferno that burneth hotter than a coal. Let's keep reading. It was in this atmosphere and against this background that the world of the slave evolved. And in other words, it was this atmosphere that the Black American culture and consciousness evolved. I'm just going to give you the full keys, right? We're not going to beat around the bush. We're not going to try to butter it up and pretty it up or clean it up. That's not what we're going to do. I'm here to bring it out and to make it in plain English so you can get the real understanding on what happened and what is currently happening and going on. Some may not like it, right? And that's okay, right? It's okay, because this message is not for everyone, and I understand that. But the intention is to make it as clear as possible for who it is for, right? Let's keep reading. It was an elemental world, the world of the slave, a world with no frills, a world of humiliation and dirt and fatigue, a world that placed a premium on creativity and the ethics of survival. This world was dominated by nature and natural needs, but it was populated by spirits and spiritual forces. The world was somewhere between Africa and a place that did not exist. That is to say, it was a world in transition, a world of changing forms and patterns, a world with no guideposts and few firm spots on which to stand. The spatio-temporal dimensions of this world were compressed. It was a world bounded by the fields and fences and the seasons of the year. As a mechanism of control, the slave masters kept the slaves ignorant. And so the average slave literally did not know where he was. And they mentally didn't know where they were either, which is one of the most terrifying things about being in the pit. It's not knowing and being able to recognize when one is down in there, right? And that recognition has to take place before one makes the journey of climbing out of it. Here we go. Somewhere on the margins of his mind was a place called Africa. Long time ago, right? And he would have heard of a place called the North and another place called Canada. But the precise location of these places and their relation to the spot he occupied were secrets the slave master closely guarded. As a consequence, the world of the slave was spaceless and timeless. It was a world of repetition, a world of doing the same thing over and over, day in and day out, of watching the sun go up and the sun come down, of summers turning into falls and winters turning into summers, over and over without rhyme or reason. Few slaves knew the days of the month or the month of the year. Frederick Douglass, who slaved for 18 years on a Maryland plantation, said, "I never met a slave who could tell me how old he was." The physical infrastructure of this world was Slave Row. From every standpoint, Slave Row was a singularly unattractive place, consisting of a single or double row of cabins and shacks located at some distance from the planter's house. The cabins were usually one-room shacks made of logs without floors or windows. Slave commentators said the windows were unnecessary since the cracks between the walls admitted sufficient light, as well as rain, wind, and dust. Whole families and unattached individuals were housed within the walls of the one-room cabins. Everything, one slave said, happened in that one room. Birth, sickness, death, everything. A good deal of light is thrown on the parameters of this world by classic descriptions of Solomon Northup, who spent 12 years in slavery in Louisiana. Let us consider his testimony. He is describing the day-to-day routine of Slave Row. The hands are required to be in the cotton fields as soon as it is light in the morning, and with the exception of 10 or 15 minutes, which is given to them at noon to swallow their allowance of cold bacon, they are not permitted to be idle until it is too dark to see. And when the moon is full, they oftentimes labor to the middle of the night. They do not dare to stop even at dinner time, nor return to the quarters, however late it be, until the order to halt is given by the driver, who was a black man. And stay tuned because we're going to get more on him, right? We haven't forgot about him. Here we go. A terrifying and demeaning world, as you can see. And yet it was in the depths of this world that the slave created a new community with its own values, traditions, codes of behavior, aesthetic forms, and even institutions or proto-institutions. On the one level, this community was a response to the negative influence of white oppression. They did right to create a culture that responded to white oppression, right? It was fitting for the slave environment and the oppressive environments. Here we go. It appears from available evidence that slaves adopted white cultural patterns that were necessary for survival and institutions that complemented African customs. And that's what Dr. Thomas Sowell talks about in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. The blacks adopted many of the ways of talking, the ways of acting, the ways of thinking, and the forms of violence from the whites in that setting, right? And it's also in the book called The Cracker Culture by Dr. Grady McWhiney. Let's keep reading. Yet, in assessing this development, we must keep in mind the totalitarian system to which it was a response. We must never forget, in short, that we are dealing with the adaptation of human impulses to a pattern of behavior coercively imposed. And that's what Dr. Audrey Smedley talks about in Race in North America, where the Negroes really had no choice but to adopt certain patterns of behavior. And when treated like a beast, people start to behave as such. Here we go. The tragedy of the slave community was that the power available to it was not sufficient to offset the divisive forces of slavery. The pattern of mating, a pattern controlled ultimately by forces hostile to the fundamental interest of blacks, illustrates the point perfectly. Slave marriages had no standing in law. The slave father could not protect his wife and children, and the planter could separate slave families at his convenience. This had at least 3 devastating results. First of all, the imposed pattern of mating limited the effectiveness of the slave family and had a sharp impact on slave morale. Second, it isolated the black woman and exposed her to the scorn of her peers and the violence of white women. Third, it sowed the seeds of sexual discord in the black community. And so, in other words, it weakened much of the family structure and it promoted a particular set of values and morals about sex and intimacy. Let's keep reading. Because of the disruptive influence of the slave master, the course of true love did not run smooth in Slave Row. Slave masters encouraged promiscuity, and there were men and women who were willing to exploit the opportunities. Some slaves had 2 or more wives, and some women were contemptuous of black males, meaning they hated them. But according to slave commentators, there were many stable unions in the quarters, and their testimony is corroborated by the numerous stories of protests and tears on the occasion of forced separation. It was not all unusual for husbands or wives to escape from the plantation and wander across the South in vain attempts to find lost mates. The behavior of husbands and wives at the end of slavery is also significant. After emancipation, the roads of the South were clogged with freed men searching for wives, children, brothers, and sisters. This is hardly the picture of a non-community without a sense of family involvement. In marital relations, as in other relations, the slaves survived by imposing their own values on European institutions and by inventing their own rituals and customs. It was fairly common, for example, for slave couples to get married by jumping over a broomstick. Now, this invention of jumping over the broomstick was not an invention of the blacks and was not brought over from Africa as was once thought. This practice, according to Southern historian John Detterer, was a Celtic custom, right? That was brought over from Europe over into the Old South, and it was still practiced in North Britain until the 19th century. And Oprah, she also has an article on her website written by Professor Diane Stewart saying the same thing, right? For those who are interested. Now let's keep reading. We are told that it was customary for slave patriarchs and matriarchs to preside at slave wedding ceremonies. In the conventional sense, this was a community without political institutions. Here we go. But the driver, the leading black authority figure, was an embryonic political figure, roughly similar to the straw boss of the Jim Crow regime and the political mediator of the modern period. The driver was appointed by the slave master, who charged him with the responsibility of supervising the work of the slaves in the field and policing the quarters at night. The head driver, James H. Hammond, a South Carolina slave master, said, is the most important Negro on the plantation and is not required to work like other hands. He is to be treated with more respect than any other Negro by both master and overseer. He is to be required to maintain proper discipline at all times, to see that no Negro idles or does bad work in the field, and to punish it with discretion. That means to put the cracking whip on somebody if they get out of hand. You're sitting there idle and not working enough, then hit you with that hot fire stick, right? And guess what? This guy didn't care about any shared physical features with the other people out in the field. He wanted his piece of the pie, and that's all he cared about, right? Let's keep going. He is a confidential servant and may be a guard against any excesses or omissions of the overseer. For these services, the driver received special food and other perquisites. And what else? Daniel, a driver on the Mississippi plantation, was granted the privilege of 2 wives, right? Not one of them, he had 2 of them. And for 2 wives, we already know he was going to tell on everybody on the plantation. Don't let any plans about escaping get out around him, because he was for sure going to snitch. Watch this. But when he displeased the slave master, one of his wives, his favorite, was taken away. Caught in the crossfire between the slave master and the slaves, the driver inhabited a twilight world between warring camps. There was, in fact, no solution to the built-in ambiguity of the role, and many drivers succumbed to the corruption of derived power. Such men were loathed by the slaves, right? I know they hated the mess out of them. It was not uncommon for slaves to harass and assault drivers. And I don't blame them one bit. They knew that he was not working on their behalf. His job was to keep them in line and down in the pit, right? Further down below him. The case of Eli, a driver on a Mississippi plantation, is instructive. He drove his charges so hard that they ambushed him one day and killed him, right? They sent him to the afterlife. They were tired of him. There were other drivers who did what they could to soften the impact of slavery. So at least we know that there were a few of them that were at least decent, just like there exist some good and genuine politicians, right? It's not always everyone. We understand that. Let's keep going. Solomon Northup and other drivers say they conspired with their fellow slaves to outwit the masters by faking whippings and institutionalizing other practices that made the task of the slaves easier, right? And here's one example of someone who was working on behalf of them. Although the driver was the leading figure of the plantation, he was not necessarily the leading black figure in the slave community. On almost every plantation, there were 2 or 3 slaves who wielded authority, not because of their relation with the slave master, but because of their relation with their fellow slaves. One slave master said it was a notorious fact that on almost every large plantation of Negroes, there was one among them who holds a kind of magical sway over the minds and opinions of the rest. To him they look as their oracle. The influence of such a Negro, often a preacher, on a quarter is incalculable. On one plantation, the leading black patriarch was Old Abram, who was said to be deeply versed in such philosophy as is taught in the cabin of the slave. An old woman named Juba, who wore charms around her neck and regaled her followers with details of her many visions of the devil, occupied roughly the same position on a Mississippi plantation. And a Louisiana planter noted that Big Lucy was an indigenous leader of the slave community who corrupts every young Negro in her power. The slaves also had their own specialists in matters of decorum, dress, and worship. Significantly, the slave community seemed to have been totally democratic in the sense that the highest roles were open to female talent. The roles in the slave community were organized into institutions or proto-institutions. They were institutions, i.e., organized patterns of behavior for maintaining community standards, for dealing with the white man, for inducting new members into the group, and for expressing the soul and style of the people. Some of these institutions were more or less direct translations of African institutions in the light of new realities. Others were creative blendings of African and European forms. Still others were free improvisations of European themes. The slave was equally inventive in the field of religion, creating a whole constellation of the patterns and forms that gave a new dimension and a new meaning to Christianity. Another commentator who caught the real meaning of the slave's maneuver was ethnologist Paul Radin, who said that the slave's religion was an expression of a thrust toward liberation. He added, the antebellum Negro was not converted to God, he converted God to himself, meaning they made God in their own image and after their own likeness, which is what anyone does who personifies, anthropomorphizes, or gives a personality to the creative force, right? The slaves shaped it into something that they can understand and make sense of within the context that they lived in, right? And so for the slaves, it was translated or transformed and interpreted as a deity that would deliver them from slavery, while the white man's deity was one that would keep them in there. Understand? And let's keep reading. Unquestionably, and it is important to view this conversion in context, most commentators have managed to suggest that conversions of the slave was a free choice. But this view is contradicted by 2 facts. First, slave masters used force and violence to prevent slaves from practicing their own rights. Secondly, the evidence seems to suggest that the adoption of some religious form was necessary, not only because religion is a focal point of African culture, but also because it is generally a focal point of survival in a situation of oppression. Understand this. Since the slaves could not continue their own mode of spiritual behavior, they had to find an outlet for their spiritual passion or die. And we'll talk more about this topic of religion in much later videos when we get back to that, right? I have not forgot about that. We will get back to that, but let's keep going. Slaves also used music as a medium of communication. The cries and hollers and field calls contained secret messages and code words. In truth, Double meanings permeated the whole fabric of this music. There are images of release. The walls come tumbling down. In battle, he said, and if I had it my way, I'd tear the building down. A former slave said slaves had field calls and other kinds of hollers that had a meaning to them. One song, for example, used Jesus' name to mask an open and obvious invitation to the slaves to steal away freedom. Dancing represented another rhythmic element in the slave ethos. The slaves did the hoedown, the cakewalk, and other prototypes of modern dances. In other cases, the dances were translations of African movements, a fact verified by an investigator who later photographed an African tribe dancing what was perhaps the original of Charleston. Almost all observers were impressed by the skill of the slave dancers. We are told that the slaves danced with the whole body, a fact which astonished one white auditor who believed apparently that it was possible to dance some other way. The way of life embodied in the dances, songs, and social practices was passed on from generation to generation by informal educational institutions. Mothers and fathers and community elders passed on to the young the accumulated vision of the group and its particular perspectives on the reality of power and the shape and contour of the natural and spiritual worlds. They taught the young how to survive and how to outwit the white man. They did this consciously and unconsciously by the power of the word and as well as by the power of example. Viewed from the vantage point of the 20th century, some elements of the slave lore were negative, but these elements were part of a total process that enabled a besieged group to survive until the balance of forces changed. And that's the key to the entire message, that the culture and the consciousness that they developed was appropriate and it was fitting to survive under those types of circumstances. And they did exactly what they had to do, and they made it work, right? Just like anyone else would have done in that same situation. They showed resilience and also creativity through the rough and terrible times. And one thing is for sure and for certain, they never gave up, right? Like they kept their head as high as they possibly could for the environment that they were in. But after the physical slavery was over and the physical chains were removed, they still had the mental chains attached and latched on to their mind. And those mental chains are still very much latched onto the minds of the vast majority of their descendants. And understand that it's very difficult to pick the lock on these mental chains. But with the use of the right set of keys, you can insert them into the lock, turn the key, and the chains fall right off. And then a new world opens right before your eyes. This is the reward for those who make use of the magic keys. And the secret is, you already possess them, but you just don't know it yet. And so hopefully this video has shed some light on the topic and has given you some understanding and something to think about. Right now, I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.